I grew up believing my dad was a hero. Everyone in our small town used to praise him. Hardworking. Family man. Self-made. But living with him was a completely different story. Behind closed doors, he was cruel, controlling, and selfish. My mom, Emma, worked herself to the bone at a small bakery, while he sat around pretending his successful auto shop made him some kind of big shot. I was 15 when I realized he didn't actually love us. He loved being seen as the perfect husband and father. He'd throw dinner parties, acting charming, cracking jokes, pretending to care about us. The minute the guests left, the smile would drop. He'd yell at Mom for not serving the food fast enough, for embarrassing him in front of his friends. One night, I saw him shove her so hard she fell against the counter. She didn't even cry, she just whispered, "It's fine," and cleaned up the broken glass while he stomped upstairs. That image never left me. From that day on, I promised myself I'd get her out of there someday. By the time I turned 18, I was working 2 jobs. At a diner and a hardware store. Every dollar I made went into a secret savings account Mom didn't know about. I wanted to surprise her one day with a small house, just for us. But life had other plans. Dad's business started to fail. He blamed everyone except himself, the economy, his employees, even Mom. When I offered to help him with bookkeeping, he snapped. "You think you're smarter than me, huh? You'll never be more than a waitress." That night, I told Mom I was leaving after graduation. She begged me not to, terrified he'd take it out on her. So I stayed another year, saving quietly, pretending everything was normal. Then came the night that changed everything. He came home drunk, angrier than usual. I don't remember what started it. Something about the electric bill. But he grabbed Mom's wrist, twisting it until she screamed. I stepped between them and told him to stop. He shoved me so hard I hit the floor. Something inside me snapped. I stood up, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "If you touch her again, I'll make sure you regret it." He just laughed and walked away, muttering something about ungrateful kids. But that moment shifted everything. For the first time, he saw that I wasn't afraid anymore. A week later, I moved out. Mom didn't come with me, she said she couldn't. She was too scared of what he'd do if she left. I rented a tiny room above a grocery store, started taking community college classes, and kept working at the diner. Every Sunday, I'd visit her. She always looked tired, smaller somehow, like life was draining out of her a little more each week. Years passed. I built a life. Got a degree in business management, landed a steady job at a tech company, moved to a different city. I barely spoke to Dad. Mom would call sometimes, telling me he was getting old and wasn't as bad anymore. I didn't believe it, but I let her have her peace. Then, one morning, I got the call. Mom had died. Heart failure, the doctor said. But when I went home for the funeral, the truth was clear. She'd been worn down, emotionally and physically, after years of living under his thumb. Standing over her casket, I promised her something. I whispered, "You'll never have to forgive him. I'll make sure of that." Dad showed up to the funeral dressed in an expensive suit, pretending to cry. People comforted him, saying things like, "She was the love of your life," and "You were such a devoted husband." I stood there, silent, disgusted. When he finally came over to me, he tried to hug me. I stepped back and said, "Don't. You don't deserve to touch her or me." He glared at me like he used to when I was a kid, but this time I didn't flinch. After the funeral, I went through Mom's things. Buried in her dresser, I found an old notebook, full of receipts, notes, and pages where she'd written about her fears. She'd been keeping track of every time he hit her, every time he threatened her, every lie he told to their friends. The last page said, "If something happens to me, promise you'll live free." That's when I decided it was time to take back everything he'd stolen. From her. And from me. I spent the next year quietly pulling pieces together, and I still remember the strange mix of panic and relief the day it all clicked into place. I had built a small but steady nest egg from years of overtime and side gigs, and after Mom died, I stopped pretending I didn't want more than just stability. I wanted power. Not for revenge, but so no one could ever treat someone the way Dad treated her. I started looking at properties the way I used to look for bargains at the thrift store. What needs work? What could be fixed? What could be made better? I found the Windsor Club almost by accident. A once grand place tucked into a neighborhood that still cared about tradition. It had been mismanaged for years, the board drained by bad hires and worse decisions. Membership dwindling, the building itself leaning toward neglect. To the town, it was an institution that deserved to sink politely into memory. To me, it was a chance. I didn't announce anything. I formed a holding company, raised capital quietly through legal channels, signed the papers at dawn when the bank was empty, and the world felt like it belonged to me for the first time. The sale closed in a whisper. I was the managing partner of Windsor Holdings LLC by lunch. I remember standing in the empty ballroom that afternoon with a contractor and a clipboard and thinking about all the small cruelties Mom had swallowed because she didn't have options. I promised myself she'd never be alone in that kind of helplessness again. I spent the following months restoring the place, but I didn't do it to impress anyone. I replaced tired fixtures, fixed the HVACs so the kitchen wouldn't shut down in summer, updated the staff uniforms to be comfortable and practical, and put new systems in place so complaints from employees wouldn't disappear into a drawer. I hired an executive director named Nora, who knew clubs like this inside out. By reputation, she was firm and fair, and she didn't mind that I wanted the place run right. I also met Mrs. Palmer, a hostess who'd been there forever, and whose husband had been helped anonymously 2 winters ago, when meds were denied. She didn't know it was me then, and she never asked. She only nodded when I told her I wanted people treated like people, not problems. The town's gossip left me alone for the most part. Windsor was a curiosity at first. Who is this quiet new owner? Word moved slowly through dinner parties and phone chains. But nothing prepared me for the morning I chose to tell my family. I was inviting them to brunch. I wanted them in the room when the rules were enforced. Maybe that sounds petty, and maybe it was. But more than anything, I wanted them to watch what happens when dignity has a guard. I pulled into the club that morning, and the old anxiety rose in my chest. Polished stone that wanted me to shrink. The soft hum of voices already measuring me like one more thing to manage. I smoothed my blazer and practiced my face until it felt like armor. My parents were already at a corner table, perfect in their way. Dad, in a light linen suit, with a posture he believed said authority. Mom with a neat string of pearls and a practiced smile, my sister Mara like a glossy ad come to life. They looked the part from across the room. All small approvals and tight mouths, the kind of faces that had always been practiced to prevent emotion. When they saw me, Dad's eyes narrowed the same way they had when I wore the wrong dress as a kid. I felt the old rush of wanting to apologize, to fold into their expectations, but I also felt something else, an even steadier pulse of calm. The conversation started the second I sat down. You know how we do things here, Dad said, loud enough for nearby tables to lean toward the drama. This is a respectable establishment. I answered, steady. That's why I'm here. I own it now. The table went quiet around us like a dropped pin. Mom mouthed the words, "You what?" And Mara smirked in that way that always meant she knew what she was supposed to think. Dad waved a hand toward the manager like he's used to doing when he wants someone else to enforce his preferences. The manager introduced herself, Nora, and the small ritual of rules began. But this time Nora didn't look at Dad for permission. She looked at me. She explained Article 7.2 about conduct damaging to the club's reputation, public humiliation, creating disturbances, and so forth. Dad sputtered that he'd never been called out in 30 years of membership, that the club belonged to families like theirs. I listened. It was surreal to watch the man who'd spent my life telling me I didn't belong try to use tradition as a shield. When he demanded the owner be brought in, Nora looked at me and another small thing shifted. The room recognized me as more than a rumor. I told them we should move somewhere private to discuss this, and we did. We walked down a wood-paneled hall that held the portraits of people who'd defined the town for generations, and into Nora's office, where Maggie, the assistant, had already laid out the membership file. She read off the acquisition papers like a verdict. Windsor Club was acquired 7 months ago, she said. Bay Windsor Holdings LLC, with Ms. Alvarez as managing partner. My father's face changed from irritation to something like stunned fury. The sound he made wasn't a laugh, it was disbelief. He accused me of publicity, of ostentation, of some practical joke. I told him the truth. I bought a distressed property. Because it was a sound investment. And because it was hurting people who worked there. I told him I'd spent months fixing things so the staff would stop being afraid to speak up. His jaw tightened. Then he went small and mean, the way bullies do when they can't find leverage. Who gave you the right? He said, as if the question mattered. I did. That's it. I felt myself speaking in paragraphs I'd practiced only in my head, the long history of small cruelties. The receipts Mom had kept. The women in housekeeping who had been shushed when they complained. I told him actions have consequences. Nora asked Mrs. Palmer if she would make a statement about what she had seen on the terrace that morning. Mrs. Palmer stepped forward and said in a clear, steady voice that she had witnessed my parents trying to humiliate me and request my removal. The room listened. I instructed Nora to follow procedure. Document the incident. Issue an interim suspension, while the Compliance and Discipline Committee reviewed it. My father sputtered, then shouted, then finally looked like a man watching his chair pulled out from underneath him. He called his lawyer, threatened lawsuits, said the town would care. I signed the temporary suspensions for him, for my mother, and for Mara. I felt none of the triumph I thought I might feel. Instead there was a strange, quiet satisfaction, like rightness settling into place. They were escorted out politely by security, still shouting indignation about how unfair it was. I watched them walk to the parking lot, shoulders tight, and for the first time in my life I felt no need to run after them to beg for mercy or approval. I sat back down in Nora's office, with a cup of coffee Mrs. Palmer had brought. She set it down with a small smile and said, "You did the right thing." The kind of words you only get when someone knows both what it costs and what it saves. I thought about Mom's final note, "Promise you'll live free," and realized for the first time I had. The next few weeks felt almost unreal. Word about what happened at the Windsor Club spread fast. In a small town, stories mutate in hours, and everyone suddenly had an opinion. Some said I'd embarrassed my family. Others whispered that it was about time someone stood up to them. I didn't care about either side. What mattered was that people like Mrs. Palmer and the kitchen staff finally worked without fear of being talked down to. For once, the club felt like it belonged to the people who kept it alive, not the ones who used it to feel important. Still, there were days when the silence hit hard. I'd come home from the club's office, after long renovation meetings, and feel that hollow ache of missing Mom. I wanted to tell her how it all turned out, that I did exactly what she asked me to do. Live free. But every time I thought about calling her old number, the reality punched back. She was gone. And no victory could fill that space. The first letter from my father's lawyer came 2 weeks later. It was the usual. Threats of defamation, emotional distress, wrongful termination of membership. Nora just laughed when she read it. "He can bluster all he wants," she said. "You've followed every policy." I thanked her, but part of me wasn't sure it was over. He wasn't the kind of man to just give up. I expected him to show up again, to make a scene, to demand an audience. But he didn't. Instead, Mara called me one afternoon, crying. "You've ruined us," she said. "Dad's furious. Mom won't even leave the house. What were you thinking?" I stayed quiet, letting her vent, until she ran out of words. Then I said, "I was thinking about the years Mom spent, covering his bruises and excuses. I was thinking about all the times we both pretended things were normal, just so he wouldn't explode." She hung up without replying. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the old notebook I'd kept. Mom's notebook. I turned to the last page again, tracing the faded ink where she'd written that promise. It wasn't revenge that kept me going anymore. It was something cleaner, smaller, and steadier. Peace. For once, my choices were my own. The club started thriving under the new system. Membership grew slowly, but the right kind of people joined. Families who valued respect, not appearances. The staff turnover dropped to almost nothing. People smiled more. I hosted charity dinners for the local shelter, set up scholarship programs for employees' kids, and renamed the main hall after my mom. I didn't put her full name on it, just Emma Hall, simple and honest. When we unveiled the new plaque, Mrs. Palmer held my hand. She'd be proud, she whispered. I believed her. Months passed before I heard from my parents again. It came in the form of a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a short letter written in my mother's handwriting. The date told me she'd written it years earlier, maybe when she thought about leaving him, but couldn't. The letter said, she hoped I'd never let him break me the way he broke her, that she knew I'd grow stronger than both of them. It ended with, if I can't leave, promise you will. I cried harder than I had in years. I realized she'd hidden that letter somewhere he couldn't find, waiting for me to discover it when I was ready. That night, I drove to the edge of town, to the little park she used to take me to when I was a kid. I sat on the old swing set, watching the sunset fade over the trees, and I felt her there. Not in a ghostly way, but in that quiet strength she'd always carried. I whispered, I did it, Mom. We're free now. When I got home, I opened my laptop and drafted a press statement for Windsor Holdings. It wasn't flashy. Just a simple note about our mission. Rebuilding spaces with integrity, turning old systems into safe ones. We weren't just renovating buildings anymore. We were rewriting the way people treated each other inside them. I sent the statement, closed the laptop, and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval or permission. The next morning, as I walked through the club, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, I saw people laughing, working, living, not pretending. It hit me then that Mom's wish wasn't just for me to escape him. It was for me to create something better in the world he tried to ruin. I had done that. And maybe that was the real inheritance she wanted me to have. Not the pain, not the past, but the power to choose what came next. A full year passed before I saw my father again. It was a crisp autumn morning, and I was walking through the club's garden, going over plans for the annual charity gala, when I heard his voice behind me. I froze before turning around. He looked smaller somehow, thinner, the confidence he used to wear like armor completely gone. You won, he said quietly. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, studying the man who had once dominated every room he entered. Now he looked like a stranger. It was never about winning, I finally said. He gave a bitter laugh. That's what people say when they're on top. I sighed, feeling a wave of exhaustion instead of anger. No. That's what people say when they're done fighting. He hesitated, glancing around as if hoping someone would interrupt us. But no one did. The club was busy. Staff moving between tables, laughter spilling out from the terrace. Life went on, and for once, it went on without him at the center of it. Your mother would have hated what you did, he said next, though his voice trembled. She believed in family. I met his eyes. She believed in love, not control. You never understood the difference. For a long moment, we stood there, the air thick between us. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. The fight was gone from him. He looked tired, old, defeated in a way I didn't think possible. For the first time, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man who had built his whole life on fear and pride, only to end up alone with both. I'm not here to argue, he finally said. I just wanted to see it. The place you rebuilt. I nodded. Take a look then. I walked away, leaving him standing by the fountain. I didn't turn back. Later that day, Nora told me he'd left quietly after a few minutes. No scene, no speech, just a slow walk out to the parking lot. A few weeks after that, I got a call from Mara. Dad had suffered a stroke. He was in the hospital, recovering but weak. She wanted me to visit. I told her I'd think about it. For days, I wrestled with the idea. Part of me wanted closure. Another part knew some wounds didn't need reopening. In the end, I went. When I walked into his hospital room, he looked smaller than ever, his face pale against the white sheets. He turned his head slowly when he saw me. "You came," he whispered. I nodded. "Yeah, I came." We sat in silence for a long time. Then he said, "I wasn't good to you or your mother. I know that." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was more than I ever thought I'd hear. "No," I said softly. "You weren't." His eyes filled with tears, and for a second, I saw fear. Not the kind he used to instill in others, but the kind that comes when someone finally realizes what they've done, and there's no time to undo it. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. I didn't know how else to be." I nodded again. "Maybe that's the saddest part." We sat there until the nurse came in. Before I left, he grabbed my hand weakly. "She would be proud of you," he said. I didn't know if he meant it, or if he was just trying to find something kind to say. But I held his hand for a moment, then let go. As I walked out of the hospital, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't happiness or relief, but something deeper. Release. I drove back to the club and walked through Emma Hall. The lights were soft, the smell of fresh flowers in the air. On the wall beside the plaque, I added a small framed photo of Mom, and me from when I was little. Her arm was around me, and we were both laughing. For the first time, I realized that's how I wanted to remember her. Not as the woman who suffered, but as the one who loved. A few months later, I got the call that my father had passed away in his sleep. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just sat quietly, thinking about how endings rarely come with fanfare. Sometimes they just happen, quietly, the way healing does. After the funeral, which was small and simple, I went back to the club. The sun was setting, golden light spilling through the windows, and I could almost hear Mom's voice in my head. Soft, steady, proud. I stood in the middle of the hall and whispered, "It's over." That night, as I locked up, Mrs. Palmer caught me at the door. "You're heading out early?" she asked. I smiled. "Just tonight. I think I've earned some rest." She nodded knowingly. Outside, the air was cool. The kind that hints at a new season coming. I walked to my car, took one last look at the building glowing behind me, and felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. The story that began with fear had ended with freedom. And in that quiet moment, I finally understood what Mom had wanted for me. All along, not revenge, not redemption, just the simple, unshakable joy of being free.